From Flourish DX School, this is the Flourishing at School podcast. With mental health becoming a global priority, we are your partner for creating schools where students, teachers and school leaders feel good and function well, becoming the best versions of themselves and contributing to a flourishing world.
Welcome to the Flourishing at School podcast. I'm Tamara Lechner. Each week, my co-host Jason Van Schie and I bring you the best practitioners, academics, and everything in between in order to inform best practice in whole school mental health. Except this week, we have a different plan for you because the last 4 of our 5 guests have mentioned Geelong Grammar School, but we haven't really talked about what that school is. Every single guest has mentioned Perma, and you might not know what that is either. So this week we thought we would just slow down a little bit and stop assuming that our audience knows what we're talking about. And we're going to lay a foundation, a common language. We're going to practice what we teach, practice what we preach. But before we do, let's start like we always start with a little well-being check-in. So Jay, we are both home for the second episode in a row. This is like a streak. Yay, that's helping my well-being. Yeah. But what are you doing right now to take a little greater care of your well-being?
Well, I think actually now that you say that, we are home for this episode, but I think for the next 4 episodes, because we're actually recording 4 next week, even though that will come out over the course of a month for our listeners, it's all going to be when I'm traveling in Sydney. So yes, so we'll take this and relish this opportunity to be at home. For my well-being at the moment, I'm working. I'm actually engaging with something that I'm really passionate about and find really purposeful. So, I'm really enjoying some of the projects that we're working on at the moment, which allows me to use my signature strength of creativity. And I get to work with some great designers and people which allow me to use my appreciation of beauty character strength as well. So, working, connecting with my purpose and passion and leveraging some character strengths, always good for my well-being.
So 2 things that are awesome about that. First one is that working is taking care of your well-being, because so often we're hearing people say, I need a break, I need to calm, I need to slow down. And so I love that you've just pointed out that not everybody needs the same thing to feel good and function well. Yeah,
my background's occupational psychology, right? And we know that good work is good for people. It shouldn't be a 4-letter word, right?
True.
If we do it, it's like Adam Grant says, and it sounds like everyone that we have on this podcast listens to Adam Grant. You know, how do we make work not suck, and how do we make it actually beneficial for our well-being? So, I'm very actually funny story on that. I was at a well-being conference in London a few weeks back, and there was a furniture person talking about the built environment and its effect on well-being. But at the beginning of his presentation, he asked everyone to close their eyes and think about a happy place, something that, they really liked. And I was thinking about sitting at my desk at work. and he asked people to put up their hand if anyone thought about work. And I was the only one, out of about 100 people that put up their hand. And he's like, are you crazy? I'm like, why? Why can't work be a good place to be? So, yes. That's what we should all be aspire to. But look, I've got a little bit more control over my work than most, given that I'm the CEO. But and I got to pick all the people I get to work with. So there are some benefits of being the boss. So you're really a control
freak. That's what this comes down to.
No, actually, I'm lazy in that I find people better than me at different things, and I do a big handball to them. That's why we work well together, right? I'm like, hey, Tamara, you're better at working with schools than I am, so you can look after all our school clients. So I'm really glad to be handing that over to you.
And I'm glad to take that ball. And so the second part of what you said that I want to just highlight is that you talked once again about the character strengths. And I know that in our last episode, Hector talked about the character strengths, Gilda talked about them. So we're going to unpack a little bit later for people who are listening that have no clue what these character strengths are and how you get some. Don't worry, we're going to unpack this today for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked about how we wanted to explore things like Geelong Grammar, like this Perma model, what are character strengths. So it's going to be, I think, back to basics episode, right, as you suggested. So you, Tamara, actually used to work with Geelong Grammar School with their consulting arm representing North America. So you'll have a very good insight into who Geelong Grammar are and what the consulting was all about. So in saying that, Geelong Grammar no longer really offer an external consulting model anymore. Their focus now is more back internally on the school. But, during your time at Geelong, tell us a bit about, who are they? Why is everyone referencing them when we're talking about wellbeing in schools?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I have to say, I first heard about them when I was reading, and I thought they were the Geelong Grammar School. I had no idea because I had only seen it written.
Like the Melbourne.
Yeah, exactly. And so I had heard about this place, and it sounded like some mecca for education because they had really taken positive psychology concepts and applied them to school. They wanted to place well-being at the heart of education. So they really were pioneering. This was probably 12 or 13 years ago now that they started. And I think the reason that everybody talks about them was because they were first, and they were working with Martin Seligman, who was another first, the University of Pennsylvania professor. And at the time, he was the head of the American Psychological Association. And he was the first guy to say, it's awesome if we focus on detriment and absence of mental health. But if you fix that, you're just at zero. And maybe zero is not enough. And the team that were at Geelong Grammar at the time had a donation for a building because when donors donate to private schools, they usually like to donate a building. But at the time, the head of their school had a wonderful idea that what if this building wasn't just a place for athletics, and it wasn't just a place to have the mental health counselors, but it was also a place that contributed to building the well-being of staff and students. And so they went on a deep journey. They created their own model based on tons and tons of research, and they decided they were going to change the way they did education. And so not only does their model have an explicit teaching and a curriculum, it also has training for everybody who works in the school, from the school bus driver to the lawn fellow who's dealing with the turfs for their footy league. Everybody that works on the campus has to be trained in their well-being protocols. And I think because they were the first, and because they did it in such a deep way, they really have become a pioneer school, a school that is considered an exemplar for if you've done all of the things right, you might be like Geelong Grammar. What was interesting when I was there, they were developing what they called their roadmap that would tell you how far along your journey to being a whole school well-being school you were. And at the time, they were 11 years in, and they were only rating about 70-something% through their journey. So I loved that they didn't think they were done. And they've certainly been an inspiring place and also a teaching place. They had the institute for a while that was very external focused. And so they offered more tools and a framework and a curriculum and things that felt usable by other schools. And so that's who we're talking about. When we're talking about Geelong Grammar School, they were kind of the first to market in business terms. And they're not the only school. I've met many schools around the globe who are doing great things, but I think that's why we hear their names so frequently, is just because they were first.
Yeah, and definitely they get referenced a lot by Marty Seligman because of the connection. And, so whenever there's a big report, they usually will point out, that Geelong Grammar School were the first, and this is kind of where this whole positive education movement came from. Interesting, like you say, even though there's been so much investment and they've been on the journey for 11 years, how they only rate themselves at 70%. And look, I've seen people like Justin and David, who used to, lead the program at Geelong, talk very openly about, hey, just because we've invested so much in this doesn't mean that we don't have mental illness in our school community. They still have all of the same, mental ill health issues as what other schools do. I guess, if we consider our conversation with Hector last week, it's you're not going to be able to just get rid of that, but can we give people skills that translate not just, whilst they're at school, but into adulthood? And particularly, can we teach them things about, how to identify your purpose in life and what else? That's important. Mental mental illness is a continuum, right? And people will move up and down that. But if people have got skills to understand where they're at and to spend more time flourishing, then, that's terrific.
Yes, absolutely. And one thing that came to mind when you were talking about, are we going to reduce mental ill-being by having a school like this? An interesting thing that happened was they actually had more students referring themselves to the counselors. So Geelong Grammar is a big campus. It's a boarding school. They have counselors on staff that are in that building that I was talking about, the Hanbury building. And they thought when they started being a pause ed school, as they call themselves, that they would have a reduced number of students going to these counselors. And in fact, the exact opposite was true, because the students started to recognize when they were having an absence of mental health, or they had something go wrong that they needed some help with, and they were suddenly unafraid to go and find the help they needed. So that's one of the interesting outcomes that I often see with schools who start this work, is initially they may see more instances of students seeking external help, which is actually wonderful, but it can seem the opposite to a school who's just taken on something that's supposed to promote well-being, and all of a sudden they're seeing an increase of people being triaged to their counselors.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because I spend more time these days working with corporates than I do schools. And we see something very similar with employee assistance programs, or, counselling programs for staff to access. And there's always this question of, hey, if a lot of people are accessing the service, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And so generally, workplaces are trying, and people running the EAP are trying to increase the utilisation rate to make it a good investment for the organisation. But it's like, well, it's very hard to determine, is it actually a good thing or a bad thing? Like, is there more mental illness, or are more people willing to take proactive steps when they start noticing the first signs that they're not, like you're saying, having those signs of good mental health, and trying to intervene early?
I think that's one of the reasons that the language, the literacy around it is so incredibly important. One of the things we see in high schools, because there's been this huge movement to talk about your mental health, it's almost contagious negatively, where having anxiety became a cool thing. Everybody wanted to have a stress reduction dog. Everybody wanted to have the need to have that. And so it became a banner of coolness to talk about having anxiety, being anxious. And I always caution people that everybody has anxiety. And if you talk about it as though it's something you've caught and something that's a heavy load you're going to have to carry for life, you're doing yourself such a disservice, because yes, there are times where everybody feels a little stress, feels a little anxiety. That's important to point us towards our purpose, to point us towards what matters. But when teen girls all want to have anxiety because the head of the cool chicks has anxiety, that becomes a problem, because anxiety does become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then when you start to get anxious about having anxiety and being in the group of anxious girls, that's hard to pull apart. And I've talked to a few school counselors who are doing a really brilliant job of separating the label from the human. So you can feel anxious, but you aren't anxious. You can experience anxiety, but don't label yourself as an anxious person. And so those little nuances that we see in a school culture that has a well-being literacy make such a difference in even how having the conversations around mental health help or hinder.
Yeah, that literacy is so important, and generally that's one of the first places we start when we consult with workplaces or schools. Like, let's at least give people a common language. And actually, on this topic of language, there is this term, social emotional learning, which many of our listeners might be more familiar with than, say, positive education or other kind of wellbeing models. You've worked a bit with both, so maybe you can explain the difference to our listeners.
Yes, this is a question that I've been asked many times, and over the years, the two have kind of blurred deeply. There used to be a very big divide that social emotional learning was direct to student, And it was all about skills for student emotional regulation, behavior, sometimes relationships, but it was mostly around ensuring a student had the skills to attend and self-regulate. Over time, that's really changed. And so when I'm working with clients, especially in the United States, where that is the term, and Canada still uses that quite commonly, it's very similar now to positive education. So I used to think of it that positive education was an umbrella, and under that umbrella sat SEL, and under that umbrella was also all of the organizational psychology, and you were looking at the school, you're looking at the staff situation, you're looking at the staff mental health, and that much more full and robust vision of mental health at a school used to be what I considered positive education. But over especially the past 4 or 5 years, when we've seen some recommendations coming out of Leeds University for the UK, we've seen some World Health Organization and Global Happiness. All of these places are putting out their frameworks for what is good mental health. It's become very blurred between positive education and social emotional learning, which I think is great, because I think everybody's getting it a little more right, perhaps, than they used to. One of the challenges with the term positive education was immediately when you would go in to teach positive education to teachers at a school, you would have this pushback about, well, what am I doing now? Negative education? And of course they weren't. So it was just really bad branding. But if you look at what the two are teaching, they've really morphed closer and closer together, depending on who's teaching them. It's kind of tomato now.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's good. So for our listeners, that's hopefully, I don't know, some clarity. Like they're fairly similar. They're smushed together. But I guess one thing that positive education is pretty big on is this model of wellbeing known as Perma. So this is something that we've been throwing around, as you've mentioned, the first few episodes of this podcast. So for our listeners who aren't familiar with this acronym, what is it?
Well, it started again with Martin Seligman, who we talked about earlier, and he didn't even have the full Perma. Originally, I think he had PEM, and then gradually added more and more. And so it's an acronym because people in science seem to love acronyms, and they certainly help us to remember words. And so the P, depending on whose version you're hearing it from, either stands for positivity or positive emotions. What did you first hear it as, Jason? I'm curious, because I first heard of it as positivity, and that's got such a bad rap.
Yeah, definitely positive emotions, because a lot of it obviously came from Barbara Fredrickson's research around positive emotions. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think we both consider, we're calling it positive emotions, but it's actually about the full range of emotions, and just understanding how to prolong the ones that feel good, how to initiate the ones that feel good, and how to move really quickly through those emotions that don't feel good, because they're still important. And so that's the P. For the E, we have engagement. And this one's always difficult in a classroom. When I teach teachers and I ask them, show me what a student looks like when they're engaged. Well, they all lean forward. And if we're on Zoom, they raise their hands. And there's really a stigma around what a teacher believes an engaged student looks like. And some of the students I know who are the deepest thinkers are not making eye contact because they're in their heads. And so engagement is just this optimal. It's this optimal place to be where you're interested. You are bringing yourself to the learning. There's often talk about flow, so that nice point of meeting your skill to the challenge. So it's not too easy and it's not too hard. You have some skill, but your skill is being pushed, so you really have to focus. That is a place for optimal learning. I don't like to focus too heavily on that, because I don't think school is a place where it's very easy to have that happen, because
there's
we have
a lot of
bells telling
distractions. Yeah.
We've got so many distractions, right? So I think it's less about flow and more about motivation and engaging a learner by giving them autonomy, by giving them choices, and allowing them to follow their curiosity more than a prescriptive path. But engagement, definitely, we know, plays a massive role.
And most educators would be aware of different learning styles, right? So if you're trying to get a child to do something that's not inherently easy for them or their preferred style, it's going to be much more difficult for them to be engaged. So it's about them, I guess, leveraging their strengths in suitably challenging activities where there's hopefully less distractions. But you had the pleasure of seeing Mihai Chick sent Mihai, and we've lost him just recently, unfortunately. Obviously, the person behind the concept of flow, and I know him and Marnie Seligman were good, close colleagues. So, yeah, you got to meet him at a conference a few years back. Him
twice at Claremont grad school. They do the Western Positive Psychology Conference every other year, I think. It could be every year. And I've had the pleasure of speaking at it a couple of times. And the last time was a celebration of Csikszentmihalyi's retirement. And I love his work on flow. I just don't find it happens very much in a classroom. And actually, when I do see it happen, it often is the teacher who's in flow. And that can be a problem because when you're in flow and you're going, you might not notice that you're not bringing your class along. And so that optimal engagement is, I always think of it as when I have the teacher who I remember years later, something that they taught me, and it may be nothing to do with the subject matter. To me, that feels like engagement, when I can deeply remember and apply whatever I've learned across situations, when I can generalize. And so engagement is the E.
Yeah.
Moving on.
What's the R, Tamara?
What's the R? The R is relationships. And at Geelong Grammar, they would say positive relationships, because we've all experienced relationships that aren't positive, and those ones don't contribute to your well-being in any way. And so having the skills to find a friend, to foster a friendship, to fix a friendship when something is going wrong, these are all really important skills. And in fact, the work from Robert Waldinger and his crew at Harvard, the longest study on happiness that's ever been done, which is 80 plus years now that they've followed these schoolmates from Harvard to see what has the biggest impact in their happiness in their lives. And it has been the power of their relationships. Not only do these relationships help with their mental health, they help with their physical health. And so teaching the skills of relationships in a school is really important. And good teachers know this. Good teachers naturally understand that students work harder for teachers who care. And spending that time, first off, to build a relationship with a student, but also to model those skills with the students in the class so that they can understand how to build relationships across a lifetime. Super important for well-being.
Yeah.
That's the R.
That research is one that I always point out when talking about the power of relationships. And importantly, it's the quality of one's relationships, not the quantity.
Exactly. I always say I would rather have a quarter than 25 pennies.
Yeah, absolutely. So that brings us to the M.
So the M, I'm just going to aside here. Every time we come to a next letter, I'm in my head checking, do I know what this letter means? It's late here on Vancouver Island, and I don't want to forget any of Perma. So the M is for meaning and purpose. And recently, Marty has done some new research, and they've shifted the terminology a bit to talk about mattering instead of meaning. And I'm really interested to see how his work with Gabriella Kellerman and Alexei Robichaud out of the Better Up organization, that coaching organization, is shifting a little bit his thought on the difference between meaning and purpose. So having a purpose in life, why am I here, that level, versus mattering and doing something that matters, having a relationship that matters, understanding why what you're studying in a class matters. And so we know people who lack a purpose, that's why you can love your workplace, right? You said it when we started the show, that you were the only guy with your hand up, but your hand was up because you have this huge sense of meaning and purpose around your work and you like it.
Yeah, that's right. And all those other benefits, right, like good quality relationships and getting to use my character strengths, all those sorts of things help. But I totally love that movement to mattering over meaning. Meaning seems so self-serving in a lot of instances. Why am I here? I need to better discover myself, whereas mattering is like leaving a positive impact on this earth, right? That's what we want. And I think that's one of the biggest keys for flourishing.
I think so. And I love that it's a work in progress. We had meaning and purpose, and we've been teaching that for years. And this little tweak to a word really brings it home in a different way that I think this will be an important next stage in the research around well-being. And I think the whole concept of purpose seemed very big, especially when you're talking to teachers teaching students. And I know you've used the example before of a teacher saying, well, they're 11. Of course they don't know their purpose. And I always taught it like an intention, that you may not know your big purpose, your why am I here, but in any moment you can know your intention. And so my intention as a teacher in a moment might be to get this concept across in my French class, or it might be to have a positive relationship with a student so they trust me and respect me and I can help them on their learning journey. And so there always is that intention, but that's different than your big, what is my purpose? Why am I here? So I think mattering is a really great word.
Yeah, and I think it's probably good, and our listeners might be picking up on this, that positive education, social emotional learning, they're all part of the psychological sciences, and sciences that we learn over time and we adapt and iterate. It's about continuous improvement. So it's, good to see that that's happening, because that's my favourite pillar out of the 5.
I have never considered a favorite pillar. I guess we all have one. It's like having a favorite child, right? We just don't talk talk about our favorite pillars so much, maybe.
I just think it has the biggest impact, and the one if you do have that bigger picture, right, and you are aligned to your greater purpose or mission, you can have those ups and downs in your emotional state, or you might not be in flow or getting engagement in your activities, but that can kind of weather you through a lot and make you more resilient. M is my favorite, but we could probably just spend an hour just talking about Perma. So I want to move on to some other things. So what is the A, Tamara?
So A is accomplishment or achievement. And it was one of the last ones to be added because it seems a little bit hedonic to think that I have to do something to be happy. But we all know that making those goals, hitting those targets, striving for meaningful outcomes in our life does really feel important and does really boost our sense of well-being. So whether that is on the soccer pitch or whether that is getting your driver's license, making these movements towards a meaningful goal really does impact your well-being. And this is, I think, one of the reasons I think list makers do really well, because they often have in front of them a physical list of these are my goals, and they're ticking them off as they go along. And so you certainly see people who use lists as a way to keep track of their goals and their outcomes. A tool like Asana helps. You get to see at the end of the day, look at all the things I did. And that does contribute to your sense of, wow, I lived my day well.
Yeah, and this is how game designers operate, right? Like whether it's Candy Crush or whatever, giving people a sense of accomplishment by saying, hey, you just leveled up. And what they do is they craft it so that you level up very quickly to start with, so you're getting these dopamine hits, I'm feeling good, and then they make it harder and harder to achieve the next level because you don't, they're extending that reward. It's interesting, and you can understand how it helps with. It's more extrinsic motivation, right? Like there's rewards for accomplishment, but then there's the small things like you say, the task and the asanas of the world, but then there's the longer term accomplishments, right? Like I laboured a lot to get a master's degree, right? So looking back, it's hey, I'm proud of that accomplishment. I'm married. I've got 3 beautiful kids. It's that's an accomplishment, and those are things again that I think can help us with our well-being and assist us to flourish, even when times aren't as good when we can reflect back on those accomplishments through those efforts.
I think so. And I think we saw that role of nostalgia over things we've accomplished in the past really carry us through the COVID years, when we weren't able to gather and have celebrations for accomplishments of graduations, those typical things. But being able to look back with nostalgia was certainly something that contributed to a lot of people's. If you're not accomplishing right now, actually reflecting on a past accomplishment will help you along the road and until you get to your next one. And it's also, I think, that way you think about it, right? That if you want to run a marathon and the only time you're going to allow yourself to celebrate is when you run a marathon, you're putting your success in the future. I don't want to run a marathon, but if I did, I would probably celebrate each day that I ran, because that would keep me going. And so that's another thing about accomplishment is, if you think about it wrong and you delay your happiness until you get that accomplishment, it's actually not going to contribute to your well-being.
Yeah. So in our model, our flourishing profile that we use with schools, we actually break down accomplishment into feeling accomplished, having self-efficacy, so feeling you can still be successful despite setbacks. So it's kind of like tying in with resilience and grit, but then also goal setting. Are you using things like SMART or WHOOP, which, like you say, rather than just celebrating that big win at the end, how can you break a big task down into smaller ones that are timely, they're measurable, and all the rest, so that you can give yourself that sense of reward as you're going through, because we know you're more likely to be successful in reaching that longer term goal if you do that. Hey,
I'm going to point out SMART and WHOOP as two more acronyms. I think we're going to have to start a drinking game that every time we use an acronym on the show, somebody takes a drink.
Yeah, well, we might need another episode to start talking about these. Hey, maybe we can start working on name from UPenn. What's her name again? I love her. Come on, who's behind WHOOP? What's her name?
Oh, Angela Duckworth.
Angela, I love.
I wasn't on the WHOOP train anymore.
Yeah. Angela
we could
Duckworth,
get Angela on here. She's just stepped down in her role as CEO of her character lab. So,
she should have some more time available then.
Well, let's hope so.
I'll get you to work to get Angela. I reckon we'll get Angela on before we get Adam on. So
we could have a bet and see which one we can get. I'll get Angela, you get Adam. We'll see what happens.
All right, we'll get to work on that. Hey, I'm really glad though that we've decided to do this because even hearing you talk about Perma is a little bit different to how I discuss it, but I think they're both accurate. So. Well,
and I was going to say, when you were talking about this as a science, that I still will claim in this relationship of Jason and Tamara, I'm going to be the woo-woo girl occasionally and go, it is science, but it was Aristotle and it was Hindu philosophy before it was science. And so it all circles back to the same point. There's actually a...
Yeah, I was going to say, listeners, Tamara does challenge me a bit with the woo-woo. Sometimes I'm like, but I'll let her have it. That's just Tamara. That's who she is.
Heard a really cool story on a podcast I listened to recently on Sounds True, Insights from the Edge with Tammy Simon, which, again, sometimes is even too woo-woo for me. But they fed all of the texts of Aristotle and Plato and anything they could find, so the character strengths books, about being a good human, into a machine learning algorithm and had it write a book about being a good human that is being released at the end of this month. And I can't wait to read it. I'll be very interested to see what a machine spits out when it combines your science with my woo-woo.
Yes. Make sure you ping me when that comes out, because I wouldn't mind checking it out.
That's what I'm getting you for Christmas.
Hey, look, I'm just conscious of time tomorrow, so we've got a ton of other questions that we're planning on covering, but I reckon we break that and do another expert series like a little bit down the track. What I'd like to do is maybe just go through the next couple of questions we had on our agenda, and the next one is, what are character strengths? Because, that's another thing we've been talking about. Obviously, I talked about it in the introduction, how I've been leveraging character strengths. It's often referred to as the backbone of the science of positive psychology. So for our listeners, what are character strengths?
Character strengths are 24 common themes that humans have. And these, again, I'm talking about Martin Seligman a lot. We're going to have him on someday. So Martin Seligman and Chris Peterson led a team that were tasked, given money to basically look at what makes a good life and what are the strengths that humans have that have been consistent across time. So they looked at the Bible and the Talmud. They looked at current things. They looked at the Pokemon cards. They looked at Hallmark greeting cards. They had a team, I think it was, I don't remember if it was 30 or 300 researchers right now in this moment. Do you remember, Jason?
No, I would guess 30 rather than 300. That would be.
It was some. Okay, we'll go with 30 because it sounds more.
There was
realistic.
a lot of researchers.
There was a lot of smart people.
There was a murder of researchers. Yeah.
There was a murder of researchers.
That's the group name for them, isn't it?
Yeah, it is now. We're changing the language to suit our. There was a murder of researchers who looked at all of the things. And basically what they came up with was 24 strengths that everybody has. And so unlike many assessments that tell you what you have and what you don't have, these are strengths that are in all of us. But there are some that we gravitate to more easily. And so when Jason was talking about his signature strengths earlier, those are the ones I think of them as your hammer and your screwdriver and your toolkit. These are the tools you're using all of the time. But everybody uses different ones all of the time. And as you start to understand what these 24 strengths are and how not only do you have them, but we all tend to overuse our top strengths because they're so easy. So an example I often use is humor. That it's very easy to overuse humor as a way to distract in school. If you aren't confident with the material or you don't want to answer a question, that's when you start to hear about the class clown. And so that would be an overuse of the strength of humor. Often those class clowns go on to have a career in comedy. And so when they're correctly using their strength, they use it really well. So the character strengths are 24 strengths. They are a common language about what is right with an individual. And this is especially important in schools where so much focus is on the questions you missed, the things you didn't do right. If we have a place in school where we can talk about what is right with you and what your strengths are that helped you to accomplish what you accomplished, and we're looking at a solution rather than a problem, it gives us a common ground. And so with many schools, the very first thing we go to when we start a new well-being program, philosophy, whatever you're going to call it at your school, when you want to become a whole school mental health or well-being school, one of the places we often start is with this common language of character strengths so that we can share a language about what's right with you.
Yeah, I like how it's often referred to as the AntiDSM. So the DSM is a diagnostic manual used by psychologists to diagnose mental disorders. So that's a classification of everything that could be wrong in someone.
And also very, very important.
Yep, and very important, right? But then character strengths is a list of everything that could be right. One thing I'll just reiterate, maybe a bit stronger, Tamara, as well, is that when the researchers went out, they tried to make sure that it was as much a classification that could be used wherever you are in the world, regardless of ethnicity, spirituality, whatever. It's very much supposed to be a worldwide classification of strength rather than, say, a North American one.
And that's important because we're turning to a much more global time. I was reading an organizational article today talking about the subtle nuances that are different between English in Canada, US, Australia, and the UK, and how we can accidentally offend by the different ways that we use language. And so you're right, knowing that from all of the research, these 24 strengths were valued across time, across culture, around the world. It helps us to have a more global way to speak about what's right with an individual. And I know that they did want to use it as a diagnostic criteria. That got abandoned when Chris Peterson passed away. But he was working towards actually having it be the anti-DSM.
Yeah, look, I think it's a fantastic piece of work and really underpins a lot of the work that we do through Flourish, and just love, the exercises around, understanding strengths and leveraging strengths, and things like strength spotting, I think is such a valuable exercise that can be done within a school context as well.
I agree. And I have to come back to our model that we were talking about, because there's two other letters that don't help spell Perma that are sometimes thrown into that model, and I think they're incredibly important. We have one in our model at Flourish DX. So we talk about Perma with H, including health. I know others talk about it Perma V, vitality, and again, tomato, tomato. What we're really talking about is the physical contributors to your health: sleep, nutrition, exercise, not abusing substances. And so that's part of what we're talking about. And I think it's important to mention that, because with an absence of sleep, the rest of that model isn't going to really matter very much. And so it's really important to have that holistic view.
Yeah, and I can't recall if I mentioned it, but I remember visiting a school in the US and, speaking to the students. And I said, look, for your age group, you should be getting 8 to 10 hours of sleep a night. And they laughed at me because, it's a very academically focused school, but like every US school, they had a big sports program as well. It was unlikely they were going to get 6 hours of sleep a night, let alone 8 to 10, which they needed for their age. So they're just constantly tired and grumpy and all the rest. And they're trying to teach these people mindfulness and other acts of kindness and gratitude. Start with getting these kids enough sleep, so important. And if you don't have it in the model, then sometimes, you forget about it, right? When you're going, well, these are all the pathways to wellbeing, and sleep isn't one of them. But I'd say if you don't get the basics right, it's like the hygiene factors. If you don't get that right, it's not going to be good for the rest of it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And as far as sleep goes, I think it should be the first question you ask, because so many of us just aren't getting enough sleep to feel refreshed when we wake up. Most of us don't wake up without an alarm. And I know when I teach meditation, often people will say to me, I am not meditating right because I fall asleep every time. And I say, well, you must need the sleep more than you need the meditation. So take it. It's okay.
Yeah. There's so many pathways to good wellbeing, right? One's not better than the other necessarily. If you're finding that you are falling asleep at times when you're just relaxing, watching TV, reading a book, whatever, you are sleep deprived. You need to get more sleep, right?
And yet so much of the world lives that way that it almost feels normal. It certainly, when I talk to people, my family has a heavy focus on sleep because I have a son with Crohn's disease, and sleep makes a really big difference for him. I've always been very aware of my sleep, my need for maybe more sleep than the average person. And so our family probably thinks about sleep and sleeps more than the average. And when I hear what some others in the kids' community at school are sleeping, I'm amazed that you can even have your brain functioning with such little amounts of sleep.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Tamara, I think that's probably a really good episode. I think beginner episode, first of our expert series on school wellbeing, and I think we've got at least another 45 minutes just in this agenda that we had planned to talk about. But we'll do that. We'll record that another day.
Absolutely, we will do another foundation episode in the future. And that brings us to the end of this one. And I couldn't agree more that we've given a lot to our audience. So if you were listening and you'd like to watch it again, you can always find us on the Flourish DX YouTube channel. All of our episodes sit there. We would love it if you would subscribe, rate, and review us on whatever podcast you listen to, wherever you listen to your podcasts. Give us 5 stars. We would love to have it. It helps people find us. We will be sharing the best bits of this and our other podcasts on LinkedIn, so you can always find Jason and I over there. Hop over to LinkedIn and add Flourishing at School, the podcast. Connect with Jason and I. And that's it for both of us today. Thanks, Jason. I enjoyed this conversation.
I do too. I'm looking forward to the next one.
Me too. So until next time, keep flourishing at school and in life.
You've been listening to the Flourishing at School podcast. To stay up to date with the latest on whole school mental health, follow Flourish DX School on LinkedIn and subscribe to the Flourishing at School podcast at www.flourishingatschool.com.